Good evening, it's February 29th, 2024, and welcome to another one of our branches of the vine with another episode from the folks at Aleph Beta. You know, I'm always interested in patterns, contexts, and connections. Go figure. And with that, there's always this lingering question, does God speak to us today? And if so, how might that happen? So Rabbi David Fohrman has an interesting four-part series titled, Does God Speak to Us Today? And in this video series, we have those patterns and contexts and connections. And this is part 3 of 4, this understanding of Pharaoh's dreams. So let's listen, and then we'll talk about it this evening on The Dusty Feet. And of course, before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, that's when you click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. So, does God speak to us today? In this episode, Understanding Pharaoh's Dreams, we'll take a peek. So let's take a listen, see where we connect with this. Enjoy.
Hi everybody, this is Rabbi David Fohrman, and welcome to Parshat Vayigash. You are watching Aleph Beta. We've been wondering about this question, could there be such thing as non-prophetic communication between God and man, and what would it look like? We've been looking at Yosef's interpretation of Paro's dream as a possible model. If you haven't seen the last couple weeks' Parsha videos, I recommend you go back and take a look. But what we noticed last week is that in the run-up to Pharaoh's retelling of his dream to Joseph, the events that have taken place seem to mirror events that took place 13 years earlier, back when Yosef was thrown into a pit. As a matter of fact, the events that are taking place now seem to be the reverse of those events, both in chronological order and in the significance of events. Everything that happened back then, the opposite is happening now. And we ask, does that pattern continue as Pharaoh begins to tell his dream? Vayidaber Paro al Yosef. So Pharaoh says to Joseph, Bechalomi, in my dream, Hinni omed al sfat hayor, I was standing by the side of the river. Vihine min hayor olot sheva parot briot basar. And then out of the river came these 7 beautiful cows. V'yafot toar. They were beautiful of form. If you're Yosef, what would Yafot toar remind you of? There's only 2 people in the entire 5 books of Moses ever described as Yifat Torah v'Yifat Mareh, or Yifei Torah v'Yifei Mareh. It's Joseph himself and Rachel, Joseph's mother. So if you're Yosef, you're thinking, oh my goodness, these cows, they remind me of my mother. They remind me of me. This is really weird. What are they, Yosef cows? Rachel cows? But let's continue. Vatir ena ba'achu. Ro'eh can mean to shepherd, or it can mean to graze, depending upon whether you're talking about a person or whether you're talking about an animal. Here we're talking about an animal. So these 7 beautiful cows, they were grazing. But where were they grazing? They were grazing in an achu. Well, what's an achu? Turns out that the word never appears elsewhere in the entire 5 books of Moses. Well, Rashi guesses that it means swamp. So these 7 beautiful cows, they were grazing in the swamplands next to the river. But you can imagine that there might be another possible interpretation of the word. And in fact, there is. Onkelos, an even earlier commentator than Rashi, translates it differently. Aleph, Chet, Vav, Echav. The other way of reading this is Vatirena be'echav. They were grazing with their brother cows. These 7 beautiful cows. They had other cows too. Remember the ugly cows? They were grazing with their brother cows. But if you're Yosef, what would that remind you of? Remember, ro'eh, resh, ayin, hey can mean 2 things depending on who the subject is. If it's talking about people, it doesn't mean graze, it means shepherd. Now what does it remind you of? The Yafot Torah cows, those Rachel cows, the Yosef cows. They were shepherding with their brothers. Was Yosef ever shepherding with his brothers? Yes! That's the very first verse of the Yosef story. Before Yosef was thrown in the pit, before he was stripped of his clothes, before his father sent him away, before he had those dreams, before all that. Yosef ben Shvas Reishana, he was 17 years old. Hayaroeh, he was shepherding et Echav with his brothers, Batzon, the sheep. So it's crazy, right? I mean, there are these 2 sets of cows. So these Yosef cows, and then these brother cows. I mean, if we're right, then those brother cows, those ugly cows, right? Who would those be? They'd be the children of Leah cows. But that sounds pretty far-fetched. You're telling me these were Leah cows? Is there any other evidence for this? Does the text give us any further indication that this might be so? It turns out that it does. Pharaoh keeps on speaking, Vihine sheva parot acherot alot achreihen. So after this, 7 really ugly cows came out of the river too. Ra'ot toar, they were really ugly. V'rakot basar, they were thin and gaunt. Rakot, where have you heard that before? Spelled differently, but it's a homonym. Phonetically, it's the same sounds. The only other time it's used describes a woman. The only physical description we ever get of Leah is the Einei Leah Rakot. Her eyes were thin, or her eyes were soft. They really are Leah cows. Rachel cows and Leah cows grazing together. If you're Yosef, it's like, this is my life. But then continue with Pharaoh's dream, because the next event that happens must have made Yosef's blood run cold. The next thing that Pharaoh says is that the ugly cows devour alive the beautiful ones. Now, if you're Yosef, what are you thinking now? When did that happen in your life? It's the disappearance of the Rachel child. It's the pit. The realization must have hit Yosef like a ton of bricks. I dreamt that my brothers would come bowing to me, but that's not what happened. Pharaoh's dream is what happened. Those brothers, the children of Leah, they swallowed me alive. And then listen to what Pharaoh says. The ugly cows don't even look any different after swallowing the beautiful cows. They look exactly the same. It's the perfect crime. I was gone without a trace. I vanish, and the brothers come back to father looking exactly like they did before. And Yosef is wiped clean off the map of the family. This dream, it retells his life. But now let's stand back and think about all this. It's a very intriguing theory, but there's only one problem with it. It's a problem that actually must have bothered Yosef too, if Yosef had seen these patterns. It's the number of cows. You see, if those beautiful cows really represent my mother, they're Yefot Torah cows, or they represent me, Yosef, there shouldn't have been 7 of them. There should be 1 of them, maybe 2 of them. And if the ugly cows, if they represent the children of Leah, there shouldn't have been 7 of them either. I only have 6 brothers from the children of Leah. Why 2 sets of 7? 7 cows and 7 cows. So let's go back to one verse that actually is the key to interpreting Pharaoh's dream. It's the verse back in Parshat Vayetze that gives the physical descriptions of Rachel and Leah. The Einei Leah Rakot, the eyes of Leah were soft or were thin. V'Rachel hayta yefat toar v'yefat mareh, and Rachel was beautiful of form and of beautiful appearance. Yefat toar, Rakot, right there in one verse. It's the key for Joseph to understand how everything in the dream mirrors his own life. And now, the very next words, Vayehav Yaakov et Rachel, and Yaakov loved Rachel. Vayomer, so he said to Lavan, E'evadcha sheva shanim berachel bitcha ktana. I'll work for you for 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. He worked for 7 years. But Rachel was switched under the chuppah for Leah, so he worked another 7 years, and got both Rachel and Leah. 2 sets of 7 years. And so it finally dawns on Yosef. The cows are years. The beautiful cows don't represent me or my mother. The ugly cows don't represent my brothers, the children of Leah. The 2 sets of cows, they represent years, the years that my father worked for Rachel and for Leah. When I was out in the fields shepherding with my brothers, we were the fruits of those years. It was as if the 7 long years that my father worked for Rachel, they were out in the fields those years, shepherding with the 7 long years that my father worked for Leah. And when they swallowed me, it's like one set of years swallowed the other. It was like my father had worked for naught for those 7 years for Rachel, because the fruits of those years, I vanished. And then Joseph understands, yes, Pharaoh, the dream means something for me, but it also means something for you. The dream is telling me about my past life, and I connect the dots of that life until I come to the inexorable conclusion. I understand what the cows are, and then I understand what the dream means for you. Your life is all about Egypt's welfare. The dream means something for you too. There's going to be 7 beautiful years. Those are the 7 beautiful cows, and there's going to be 7 terrible years. The years of famine will make us forget there were ever even 7 wonderful years. We'd better start saving now. And so it actually seems true. God is using Yosef's life as the key that unlocks the meaning of Pharaoh's dream. When Pharaoh's talking to Yosef, God is speaking too. but only Yosef can understand. It turns out, though, that as remarkable as this is, there is yet a third layer of meaning in Pharaoh's dream. Because as we've seen, on the one hand, the dream refers to Joseph's past, and once Joseph understands that, he can connect the dots and understand the meaning of the dream for Pharaoh's present. But I also believe that once Joseph understands the meaning of the dream for Pharaoh's present, it unlocks the meaning of Joseph's future. He won't be able to understand it yet, but 9 years later he will. Let's go back to the interpretation that Joseph gives Pharaoh of this dream. In essence, he told Pharaoh, do not despair in your dream. The fact that the ugly cows swallow the beautiful cows, it doesn't mean that we're doomed, that the famine is destined to wipe us out. We can survive because those beautiful cows, just because no one remembers them, doesn't mean they can't have an impact. They have a job to do. The job of the beautiful cows, the beautiful years, is to sustain everyone, despite the fact that no one remembers them. During the years of famine, you're going to ask your average Egyptian on the street, do you remember the good years? He's going to say, what good years? All I remember is starvation. But the crust of bread that he's holding in his hand, the good years are keeping him alive, even though they're forgotten. The good cows can still have an impact, even after they've vanished. The beautiful cows, the beautiful years, have to give their bounty to the bad years, to the gaunt cows. Then they've done their job. 9 years later, his brothers will show up at his door in Egypt. They do not recognize him, but Joseph recognizes them. And Joseph's first response is Vayitnaker aleihem. He estranges himself from them. He wants to have nothing to do with them. He's going to send them home. But then something happens. Vayizkor Yosef et hachalamot. Joseph remembered the dreams. Maybe one of the dreams he remembered was this dream, Pharaoh's dream. And if he did, he would have remembered how that dream characterized the people standing in front of him now. They're the Rakot cows. They're the products of the gaunt cows, the gaunt years. And in the language of the dream, who is he, Yosef? The product of the Yifat Torah cows, the beautiful years. And what did he tell Pharaoh the job of the beautiful cows, the beautiful years are? To sustain the terrible years. The job of the beautiful cows is to take care of the ugly ones. He looks at the brothers, and as angered as he is, as chagrined as he is, he stays in conversation with them, and when he sends them home with food. When the brothers come back again, he sends them home with food. And when he finally reveals himself, the first thing he says is, don't be upset about what happened. I know why God put me here, to sustain you. How did he know that? He knew it from Pharaoh's dream. He hears about his own past in that dream. He sees the meaning of Pharaoh's present in that dream. And finally he understands the meaning of his future, why God put him there to take care of his brothers. Look at the kindness of Yosef. You know, kindness is one of those things that makes you feel all fuzzy inside, but sometimes chesed, kindness, doesn't make you feel warm. What happens when someone's estranged from you and your own family, when they've forgotten about you? When you don't matter to them, but then, years later, they're in need. Can you find it within yourself to take care of them? Anonymously, when they don't even know who you are. Yosef fulfills not just warm, fuzzy kindness, but the painful kind too. And now let's come back to the question we started with. How, if at all, does God speak to us? In the absence of prophecy, is there a way that God can speak without speaking? I think we've seen that there is. There does seem to exist non-prophetic communication. And now I ask you, might it be that even in our own day and age, when we have no prophecy, that we have that too? God speaking without speaking. I cannot prove it to you, but I'll speculate with you. After 120 years, after we die, you go up to heaven, and you say to God, God, I prayed to you, I talked with you, and sometimes I wasn't really concentrating, but there were times that I really reached out to you in moments of pain. Where were you? Where was your response? Did you ever say anything back to me? I wonder if God's answer might be, did you ever look at your life? Did you ever watch for the patterns? As you were going through events, that feeling of deja vu, that this has happened before, 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, just this string of events, did that ever happen to you? It's like we have this private message board, me and you, this slate that no one else can understand, the set of our shared experiences, your life. It's the way I talk to you. And you may not always understand the messages that I'm writing out to you on this little blank slate that we have together. But you still have to learn how to listen. Even Joseph didn't understand immediately. It took him 9 years after he heard all this to finally really understand. And you too, you may not understand. But you understand enough sometimes to know it's not a coincidence. To know that I'm tapping you on the shoulder. And even if you don't know what I mean, if you know that I'm speaking to you, sometimes that's enough. It's almost like we all have this private communication channel with the divine. Sometimes we understand, sometimes we really don't. But the slate is our own lives. It's a personal kind of language that means something only to us, the same way Pharaoh's dream meant something only to Joseph. The communication comes from the most unlikely of sources. Who would have thought that God speaking to Joseph was less through his own dreams than through Pharaoh's? But Joseph was wise enough to hear the echoes resonate in his life, to discern the voice of God. Maybe we can pick up a little bit of that wisdom too, and be ready to hear his voice in the most unlikely of places. Join me next week and I'll continue to explore some of the personal implications of this just a bit further with you.
Okay, so remember, we're revisiting the issue of whether we can be there can be non-prophetic communication from God to us, and we're going to use the dreams with Joseph and Pharaoh as our support point. We're addressing how that might be looked at, what that looks like, and especially in light of today's times with the lack of prophets, right? It's the ones we see in Scripture. We don't see those today, so how does that play out? We'll take a stab at it. So remember, what we're looking at, it's the events that are happening in the now in the Joseph story, right? Joseph is in his current moment, right? How he's seeing it from his direction. And yet for us, it seems to be almost unraveling. It's a reverse of the events we're watching them play out that's happened the last 13 years prior, right? Where we're looking at them now in the backwards direction. So as we can look at these, we can see that backwards regression, right? We can see it moving back towards the beginning. It gives us some things to think about. For us, is to make sure that we're looking at a connection, right? Because I think it's important that we try to see if we see a connection. We make sure we're really seeing something and not just something because we think we want to. So one of the things that I enjoy most about Rabbi Fohrman is his ability to say, hey, let's take a look at an idea. Let's see if it plays out, because if it should, then we should see more as it unravels, right? So when we make these kind of context points, that's when we're actually seeing these connections, especially between these two stories. The more we see things again, right? Not only the chronology of the stories, again, which I really like, the reverse of the chronology, but it's the connections and the importance they have to each other, right? The connection of the cows I found most fascinating, because when you're thinking about it personally, for him, he's having these moments of, to use the word deja vu, right? Because I think it's a good word to use. And when Joseph is hearing this, Pharaoh is sharing his story, right? He's sharing his dream. But maybe Joseph's pausing in his head. He's like, wait. I've heard these words before. I mean, I've been in this part of the story. These words that I heard are words that have been spoken about me or to me or my mom's. So now we're at that point, right? Maybe for the first time in a long time, that Joseph all of a sudden is stopping. He's looking back. He's seeing there's something that's causing me to stop and think and look back. And that's interesting, Pharaoh. So keep going, right? Because there's something I enjoy with these connections, that it's the willingness of Rabbi Fohrman to take a look, and then he'll bring up something that the sages talk about, like Rashi, right? In particular, where he has one interpretation of one of these unique words, right? Remember, we have these words where they're interesting because in Scripture, they're only used once. So we're forced to look at it in context to hopefully give us an idea about what we think it might mean, at least what it could possibly mean. So Rashi has one interpretation, and then they look back a little earlier and they find out there's possibly a different one. And part of it goes to that, what the rabbi talks about when you're talking about individual cows or herds, talking about grazing or grazing together, right? The moving of the cows and the brother cows. So Joseph, he's lived that life. The terms he's hearing, he's lived that life. He lived it for 17 years. But these words, these sounds, these images, they were in the back of their mind, in the back of his mind, and now they're unfolding, right? Because it was something that had been a part of his life. And now it's coming back. It might have even been stuffed back in the back of his head, but now it's coming to the front again. And who knows, even thought about those other dreams that he had as well, right? Was there even a conscious connection to those other dreams, a thought? I'm not compelled by that here at this moment. I'm more compelled that Joseph has lived his life, and as these things unfolded, that the aha moments, we like to call them deja vu, well, maybe we'll call them moments where things come together, right? Maybe with more clarity. So we get to see this again when Joseph, is looking at Pharaoh's dreams. And it's interesting that this is the reason why the advisors cannot interpret it. It's because they haven't walked in Joseph's shoes. They haven't worn his sandals, right? They haven't lived his life. So we don't get a reference in the story that God is giving him this revelation. It's just that God gave him his 2 dreams earlier, and Pharaoh his 2 dreams now, and Joseph, he's now making those connections with him in his life. His life. Everything up until now. That's giving him these connections. What happens? What had happened to Joseph? This is the common point. Okay, so this could be, and his brain's going, this could connect. I seeing if it might be something that I'm thinking is real. And then connecting these stories, and then we get to the lesser cow and the greater cows, right? The 2 moms, both part of his community back home. Rachel and Leah. Each described. But Joseph, he didn't hear the description. Joseph lived the descriptions, right? He understood it. He was with those people. So those words, those descriptors in his mind, the images of those people, that's what's coming back into his head. Because remember, the mother of the eldest, Leah, right, has the oldest kids. And then they go down to the mother of the youngest, Rachel, also has youngest, and just Joseph and Benjamin, yeah? But there were 12 total children, right? 10 to Leah and Zilpah and Bilhah, right? Only the last 2 went to Rachel. So we have more connections. And we're looking to see if there's anything new. Because the story pieces are enough to get Joseph's attention, right? He sees his life in some way connected to these dreams. So this is Joseph's to unravel. Well, we reach a point in the story. Okay. Have you ever had somebody tell you a story where you were listening to it and something that they said catches your breath? Like a surprise, right? Not like a jump scare, just a surprise as a piece of information unfolded. Something gets revealed that you didn't expect. It's not about being scared. It's about the realization of a part in the story. For me, it's M. Night Shyamalan's The Sixth Sense. It's the point when you realize that, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the movie, Bruce Willis's character is dead. It's a fiction story told by a master storyteller and a great director of photography, and that is revealed at the end of the movie. And you realize it's true. It catches your breath when you realize it. Again, it's not a jump scare. You're not scared at the moment. However, something's going on that surprises you. It might even give you goosebumps. And I think we're getting to this moment in the story. I think where Joseph, when Pharaoh is talking and Joseph is hearing, and he's hearing about these cows, swallowing up the healthy cows, and the flashback, and that these connections are these connections. And they're starting to fall inside of Joseph's brain like dominoes as he's listening. Because this might have been one of those moments where he'd go, okay, I've been down this road. I'm standing here, at this point, it's all coming together. That's when I'd call it a revelatory moment. Because we get the feeling through this that Joseph is listening. He's patient. He's hearing it all. He did the same thing down in prison. He listened. Joseph's still listening to Pharaoh. He's hearing these connections. He's hearing his life-connected moments. Pharaoh has more to tell. He's not finished. But things are starting to come out that are going to intrigue me, right? Because not only what's the same, but what are the differences? Because we get to the cows and we get to the 7 cows. And what are the differences? It's going to cause Joseph to pause and stop, to listen, to think. Because some things are the same and some things have changed. Joseph it's almost, I picture it like he's leaning in, like Pharaoh's telling the story and he's sharing his dream and Joseph's waiting for the finale. When he's talking about the 7s, the rabbi goes into talking about the 7s with the cows and he draws it to Rachel and Leah. I liked it. But there's also something else that I saw that maybe it adds a little bit of something, kind of a tweak. So I stayed with the theme that the rabbi had started, right? That this was going on in my head as I'm bouncing this around, and it was about the connecting of the stories and then the reversal of things, right? That was one of the key elements. And this is where we get those deja vu moments, right? It's almost like you're walking backwards. And in these 7 years, you have the 7 years of the greater cows and the 7 years of the lesser cows, and who the associated moms are, connected those in the Joseph stories. Maybe he's possibly having this, if these stay par with those connections and they're still valid, and what's happening in the story is reverse. Let's see if this goes downriver in the story with Rachel and Leah. So what we have is Leah's coming first. So let's say Leah, in this particular analogy, is going to be the lesser cows. Again, that's a description given. It's not talking about Leah as a person. We're talking about her descriptors, the words that stood out, the parts that we connect to the story. So we have Leah coming first in the 7 years, then Rachel coming second with the 7 years. So if we reverse those, the 7 stay the same. We have the exact same 7 thing. We have the 7 years and the 7 years. But the gaunt cows at the beginning and the robust cows second, that's the order of the moms. Then our pattern stays to form because they swap. The descriptors swap. So now there's that click, 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 click sound in Joseph's head as now the story gets wrapped around, because it's the only way that this could be understood is through the lens of Joseph's life. The purpose of Joseph's life, everything he'd gone through, including the choices that his dad made, they've all been for this culminating moment. How he was told that the story, the way those stories were shared with him, all of this that had happened. Pharaoh had his dream, but It's Joseph's life that helps bring it to fruition. He's going to render the understanding for all to see. There's another point that I like that the rabbi made. It was that when Joseph is listening, that he's listening to Pharaoh and he's getting these revelations, right? This is all connected with him, Joseph, right? And to the rabbi's point, this is the time that God is speaking to Joseph and not to Pharaoh. It's an interesting point. Because it's probably a subtle difference in that God is speaking to Pharaoh through Joseph, but God has chosen to let the life of Joseph speak to Joseph. It's an interesting little challenge to think about, right? That God is speaking, but into whom? And I guess it's relative to who you are in the story as to how you're hearing God. Because Joseph is teaching this to Pharaoh and making it clear to Pharaoh and allowing Pharaoh to trust him. Because Pharaoh, he's going to need to put a lot of trust back into Joseph. But that third stage, that part, the Joseph story, we're going back to the beginning dreams, the first dreams with Joseph, right? The original dreams. We're not there yet, but if we're going backwards in the story, that time won't show itself for another 9 years. It would be interesting in life for us to be able to turn and say, oh, this is the reason I'm here. I think that Joseph's story is a stark realization of that particular part, but I'm not convinced that we're all supposed to have that moment. I need to realize that I'm not Joseph. He had a very specific purpose in this, because that's where we get this lesson out of this. But I'll bite. If you have that moment, and it is part where you see that all come together, you see that purpose. Sometimes you not realize that till you're a long ways down the road. But let's say maybe you're in the middle. Joseph didn't know. You're in the middle of something and you're like, I'm not sure why I'm here. I'm not sure what's going on. I'm not sure what's happening. Maybe we need to act like Joseph. You're just going to have to write it out. Live with integrity. Live as if you're representing the God that you serve. Joseph's story, it definitely helped us see that. When he was sold into slavery from his brothers, when he was wrongly accused by Potiphar's wife and sent down to prison, he's not understanding why. But you don't hear him ranting to God about why is he unjustly being treated. I believe I see him living a life with integrity, representing his God, wherever he ended up. It's not until towards the end of the story that it's even near clear as to why we're here, and the purposes behind that, well, that started many, many, many years ago. But we're getting to reunification and reunion. Begins with the fathers and the sons, and the rest of the family will all come together. And yes, I even think there's healing. And Rabbi Fohrman goes to a very pointed part at the end as he's wrapping it up, and he goes to our view of, you've been praying to God and you're living out these moments in time in our lives, yeah? And then we're asking God, why don't you speak to me? What am I listening for? I'm not hearing it. And then God's answer might be, like we're looking at with Joseph, that the moments in our lives are part of the answer. When you think that God is not interfering in your life, we get reminded of Joseph. Those moments, in a pit, in a house, in a prison, in the court of Pharaoh. Oh, I'm going out on a limb here, and I'm thinking that Joseph is probably not thinking, well, this is all part of God's plan for my life. Yet I will propose that it is entirely possible that many of us could actually be in those moments, which is part of a bigger picture. So here might be an even more challenging question. I want to wrap this up. This is one that's really been part of me for a number of years. Could I be? Am I willing to be a part of another's life, to be part of another story? It's going to involve and be the story of another person. As in, for example, Potiphar, right? He's not a bad guy. It's quite the contrary. But his actions, they're not unexpected. They're not unreal, right? Let's be honest. But even he gets a chance to see the results of not getting the full measure later, right? But he's a part of the story. The cupbearer, one whose dream that Joseph gets to interpret in prison, a man restored to his office. He is very much a part of the Joseph story. Without his part, Joseph's still in prison. But he's not Joseph. Am I willing to realize that I could be part in another story, part of what God needs to happen to get someone to the next phase? And also, maybe, can I be comfortable with the possibility that I might never know? Because, oh yes, there is involvement there with God. There are other people. Still, it's still part of the tapestry of the story of the God of Abraham, this God who at this point in the story, he's about to take us on an explosive next section, because the people that are now getting into place are going to grow, and they're going to be prepared for another part of the story that no one expects. Exodus. So the next and final part of this series from Rabbi Fohrman, right, Does God Speak to Us Today, is God's little taps on the shoulder. And we get a personal glimpse into events in his own life. And I was touched by it. So I'm going to see you later in our final episode of Does God Speak to Us Today, on another edition of The Dusty Feet.